Okay, we've got a special guest tonight, and for those of you who have been with my channel since the beginning, you'll remember him as I believe he was the first interview that we ever did, and we finally got him back. We've been hunting him down for years, or actually maybe months, but it's great to hear from AWA legend and Minnesota's wrestling's own Mick Karch. Thanks for joining us today, Mick.
Thank you very much, Tim, and I gotta say, if I was your first guest and you're still on the air after that, then you did something right, buddy. I'll tell you that. I could have killed this territory right from the beginning.
Well, no, I mean, it has taken off, and as well, it's a bunch of my viewers out there, I've gotten, I believe, about 15 messages and emails that have said we want more AWA Unabridged, which was what our first episode was. I believe you had about 30 some likes and no dislikes, and now we're here. We've got over 32,000 views on the channel since then now, and it hasn't even been a year yet. So yeah, and I still, like my listeners know, I'm not going to waste too much time now talking about it, but we have big things planned for this channel, and it continues to grow. I'm so happy for all my listeners, but I'm really happy for the relationships I make with people like you and the other wrestlers of the area. Minnesota wrestling is great. I'm going to give a plug to Steel Domain Wrestling right now. They've been we love watching them. I know they have a big show coming up on October 22nd, and go to their Facebook page and stuff like that, and that's one of the big things, one of the big projects you still do these days is announce for them. And one of the greatest independent wrestlings in the actually one of the greatest wrestlings in the country. Who cares if they're independent or not? They are just amazing. Jay Bradley's going to be their former TNA star this time, isn't he?
Yeah, he certainly is, and he was a Steel Domain original way back in about 1999, 2000, so it'll be great to see him again. And he's really become a very, very talented veteran, kind of a ring general after all these years. So promoter Ed Hellier has decided to bring him back, and should be a great lineup. And we encourage everybody, thank you for the plug, first of all, Tim. We encourage everybody to go to the Steel Domain Facebook page or steeldomainwrestling.com, and we'll always update you on what we're doing here in the Midwest.
Definitely, yes. I don't think I'll be able to make this one with my football schedule, but I definitely look forward to my next Steel Domain show.
Sweet.
Today, though, I wanted to take us in a different direction, and something that, as a wrestling fan, that I would love to hear. I'm going to be learning myself today as we go along. But I know that you were the originator of the Bockwinkel Brigade newsletter back. That'd be the early 1970s, if I'm correct.
Started on June 12th, 1971.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, with us now in they call it the YouTube wrestling community, or people doing. Everyone has a wrestling podcast these days, and we're all like, kind of doing, but you guys didn't have that back in the time in the early 70s and stuff when you were growing up. So actually, first, can we start like what was in like 1970, 1971? What was your thoughts as a wrestling fan? I mean, how were you a wrestling fan, and then maybe take us into even what got you, how the Bockwinkel Brigade started.
Well, by that point, I had been a wrestling fan for about 11, 12 years. And, just kind of grew into it, did a lot of hanging around the matches, spent all my Saturday afternoons, and I mean all of them, in downtown Minneapolis at the Dyckman Hotel, which housed the AWA World Headquarters. At the time it was called the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club. And a typical Saturday for me back then would be to go down to the Dyckman Hotel, take a bus downtown, hang out in the lobby, wait for the wrestlers to come in. And we're actually going back to the middle 1960s when I started doing that. And from there, go to the TV studio matches at the Calhoun Beach Hotel right across the street from the Lake Calhoun in Minneapolis. And then from there, it would be, let's go down, the studio matches are over, now we go down to the Minneapolis Auditorium for the big house show. So typically Saturday afternoons were huge. I was such a devout wrestling fan, Tim. I mean, from the time I was 9 years old, all I wanted to do was somehow be involved in the business, whether it was, a peripheral involvement, doing fan newsletters or whatever. I just wanted to be around it. I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by the wrestlers as time went on, and I became more keenly aware of what was involved in the wrestling business as far as behind the scenes, how everything worked, so on and so forth. That kind of evolved. But I actually, as a fan, before the Bockwinkel Brigade, in 1964, of all things, I started a newsletter which was called the AWA Wrestling News, and it was maybe 2-3 sheets that I would print off on a mimeograph machine, send it out to correspondents around the country, and then from there, I got involved. The first fan club I ever ran was for the late Crusher Lasowski. In 1965, I started a fan club for him. And then there was a little bit of a lull before I started the Bockwinkel Brigade. But back in those days, it was totally different. Wrestling fan clubs were really the only link that the wrestling fans had where they would know what was going on in other territories, whether it was the fan clubs or the newsletters printing the results. There was no internet. There was no dirt sheets, as they say today. It was the wrestling magazines, and it was the fan club newsletters and fan club bulletins that was kind of the common link. So, we can kind of go into the history of the Bockwinkel Brigade in a minute, but our newsletter for that organization was called the Lean Mean Machine, which was the nickname that Nick gave himself when he came to the AWA territory. So I thought it was pretty appropriate that we name the bulletin that way. And what separated us from the rest of the mainstream wrestling newsletters was because we were kind of cutting edge. I would maybe put in a little bit of criticism or sarcasm or whatever the case may be directed at the baby faces. I would kind of tell it like it is, kind of walking that fine line between opening up too much and just maintaining, kind of the status quo, what a wrestling newsletter should be, informative. And as a matter of fact, our catchphrase on the front of the bulletin was, we were established to enlighten, entertain, inform, and perhaps influence wrestling fans all over the world. So that's kind of how the involvement, or the newsletter involvement for me, kind of evolved over that 6-7 year period.
Sounds like a perfect title and motto for a Bockwinkel newsletter. I mean, just knowing him and how intelligent he was and how articulate he was and how he played his heel character. Let's go back just for a second. You said to like in the mid 60s, so you were running an AWA newsletter, and a small one, but still probably very effective. And then you said you had correspondents. So how did you find these correspondents? And like, how many? I mean, are we talking 50, 100? How many things were you mailing out to people, and then how many things were you getting back in return?
I would say probably back in the day it was 100, 150, and the correspondents were always listed in the wrestling magazines. And back then, the biggest magazines in the 60s were probably Wrestling Review and Wrestling World magazines. And I know a friend of ours, George Shire, and I always share the stories how maybe once a month, maybe every 2 months, depending on how often they were published, you go down to the drugstore and you look for that new magazine to be on the rack, and you'd buy it up, and it was a little piece of heaven back then. I mean, it was just, you can't describe it to somebody if you weren't there, how much it meant. We were like kids in a candy store. And the fan club editors back then, one guy who has since passed away, his name was Don Wilson. Just as an example, he was the fan club editor for Wrestling Review magazine. So if you wanted to advertise a fan newsletter or a fan club, or that you were looking for correspondence or whatever it is, pals, whatever you want to say, you had to provide Don kind of a sample of your work, either was a newsletter or a bulletin or whatever it was, so he knew you were legitimate. If you ran a fan club for a wrestler, like I did for Nick, you had to provide him with a signed permission slip from that wrestler indicating that you had his okay to go ahead and run a fan club. Otherwise, they absolutely would not publish or publicize you on the pages of the fan club section. So it was pretty close-knit fraternity back then. Typically, wrestling fan clubs would send out maybe monthly or bi-monthly newsletters. You get an 8x10, you get a membership card. Kind of typical back in the day, but we really reached our correspondent network by reading in the magazines, and then, of course, it's kind of word of mouth. One correspondent in Oklahoma might recommend to you, hey, there's a guy in Texas that will trade wrestling programs with you. So it was really a fun kind of a network back then.
Okay, and so how many newsletters do you think you would receive a month? I mean, would you get ones from all over the country then?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And some of them were horrible, and some of them were really ahead of their time. With the AWA newsletter that I published, I think I have one copy of it here. It was so bad. Oh, my God, it was terrible. But basically what I would do is I would review the matches, maybe talk about some of the characters in the AWA, and everything was strictly kayfabe back then. I would talk about, Mad Dog Vachon is avoiding getting into the ring with Vern Gagne, kind of towing the storyline that was on television back in the day. But yeah, I mean, I would trade newsletters with some of them were huge. There was a guy out in California by the name of Bert Ray, had something called Matt Mania. Was a big wrestling newsletter. Ray Stevens had a very big fan club. His fan club president was Joe Potgeiser. There were Don Morocco fan clubs. Like I said, I had one for the Crusher. George Shire had a Ramon Torres fan club. Pepper Gomez, Wilbur Snyder, right on down the line. And it was just a fun deal. I mean, it was more for the fun of it and the sharing of information with other fans, much more than it was a business. Nobody was making any money on the thing. If you charged $1.50 for a year's worth of dues and you sent out 6 newsletters and an 8x10, you were way in the hole before you ever got off the ground. But it was just a fun thing, just a fun time.
Fun. Yeah, it doesn't sound like something that would make money, but at the same time, yeah, it was your ticket to knowing what was going on the East Coast and Pacific Northwest and all those other great territories. But was there any competition? I mean, like even us on today's world and on the YouTube networks and stuff like that. It's like we try to help each other. We see each other at WrestleMania, WrestleCon events, stuff like that, and we all are friendly and stuff like that. But there's only a certain number of wrestling audience out there, and we're all trying to get our piece of the pie so that they watch our channel and so we get our subscribers up and our views. Was there any competition, or was it so much more laid back then that it was you would help someone else even if that meant maybe hurting you yourself a little bit?
You know what? It really didn't hurt anybody at all. I don't think it was competition. I think what it was is the more your correspondence network built up and the more your fan club or your newsletter was listed in somebody else's fan club newsletter, it was just all a matter of scratch each other's backs, all for the benefit of the business, just enjoying it. Like I say, it was so much different then. We were all wrestling fans. We loved what we were doing, more so than today where everything is scrutinized with a fine-tooth comb and given 5 stars or 4 stars or talking about work rates or who's getting fired or whatever. And there was none of that back then. There absolutely was not. It was, I hate to liken it to like rock and roll fan clubs for the Monkees or the Beatles or whatever, but I guess in a sense that it really was. Again, kind of a close fraternity. There weren't a ton of fan clubs, but the ones that were out there really carved an niche. And if anybody collects the old wrestling magazines from the 60s, you go to those fan club sections and you see what I'm talking about. It was for the big stars, the Eduardo Carpentiers, the Bruno Sammartinos of the world. So it was just a whole different world, I can tell you that. Just a complete different ball game than what you see today. As far as competition, no, I didn't see it that way. I don't think anybody did. Everybody just wanted to help everybody out and promote the business.
Well, that's great. It probably was an easier time back in the '60s and a little more friendly. And yeah, and at the same time today, I mean, I would say the two biggest newsletters out there still are the Torch and the Insider. No, what am I thinking? Dave Meltzer.
Yeah, the Observer.
Observer, that's the. I'm sorry, I can't believe I forgot what his. Yeah, and and recently at the Hall of Fames and other events, I've been able to meet them both, and they are two of the gracious people in the world. They'll sit and talk to you, and I tell them, hey, I'm trying to someday I want to be like you. I'll never make it as big as you, and they don't look at me as, oh, well, we don't want to help someone take. They have both been so great. I've talked to both of them for like half an hour, and they gave me advice and tips and shared stories and everything else like that. So I have to commend both of them for being just two of the nicest people I've met. But yet at the same time, like I said, it's like there's like everyone wants to do a podcast now these days, and it does kind of get you. I mean, the wrestlers only have a certain amount of time that they're going to give anybody, so it's like we're all trying to get a piece of the pie. But that'd be kind of cool back then. So okay, well let's transition into then the Bockwinkel Brigade, because that was kind of the big one. So you were doing the correspondence, and you had all this, like you said, history, and so you were in it, and then all of a sudden you became a Nick Bockwinkel fan at some point, I'm assuming.
I absolutely did. He came into the AW. I should backtrack. I had seen stories on Nick in the wrestling magazines when he had been wrestling in Hawaii or Los Angeles, or prior to coming to the AWA, he was down in Atlanta. And I didn't think anything of it. It is interesting, but I had not actually seen Nick wrestle. And he came to the AWA in the fall of 1970. And his television persona and the way he carried himself was so completely different than anybody else had ever done before. Your typical heel wrestler back in the day was bellicose. They're screaming, they're yelling, ranting and raving, and Nick didn't do that. His promos are legendary, the way he carried himself with the $1 million words and, talking about the humanoids and whatever else. And I was just fascinated by this guy and, some of the things that he was saying. Simultaneously, the fan club bug was kind of biting me again. I wanted to get more involved because I had been away for a few years. Interestingly enough, before I approached Nick to ask him if I could start a fan club for him, I actually approached Bobby Heenan in the lobby of the Diamond Hotel, because I was a big Bobby Heenan fan back then. And Bobby was checking into the hotel, and I walked up and I said, hey, Bobby, I'd love to start a fan club for you. And Bobby looked at me and said, get away from me, don't bother me. Well, that was the end of that. And, and Bobby was in character back then, and I don't know how old I was, probably 16, 17, 18 years old, whatever, but he wanted nothing to do with it. So here's the story of how the Bockwinkel Brigade actually began. Nick was wrestling a match at the Minneapolis Auditorium, and long before the modern era where everybody and anybody is holding up a sign in the stands, a group of us were sitting in the balcony, and we held a banner up, leaned it over the balcony. It wasn't blocking anybody's vision or anything else, and it just said, Nick is the man, Nick is number one. Nick gets into the ring, and he spots it, and it kind of gives us the victory sign or whatever. Well, a couple of minutes later, one of the ushers came up to us and said, you really can't display that. You got to take the sign down. I had no idea why. I think some fan probably complained about it. Well, a week later, we're at the television studios, WTCN in Minneapolis, and this is June 12th, 1971. And I went up to Nick after the matches. I kind of caught him out in the courtyard as he was leaving. And I said, we held up a banner for you last week, and the ushers tore it down, and Nick was kind of amused by it. He didn't quite understand it, didn't understand what our consternation was. Why would we even care? He kind of chuckled, and he said, here, I'll write you a note. And he wrote a note out basically saying, this is Nick Bockwinkel, and if my fans are hindered in displaying a sign for me, I will be personally offended and take it as a personal affront. What we were supposed to do with that, no, I have no idea. Obviously, it anything legal and binding? Were we going to show it to the usher if he took a sign down? I have no idea. But anyway, at the same time, I asked him, can I start a fan club for you? And not only was it me, it was a couple other guys, including the late Paul Pushman, Playboy Buddy Rose, who was a huge Bockwinkel fan at the time. And we're all kind of surrounding Nick, but I was going to be the guy putting out the newsletter and what have you. So Nick says, yeah, well, that's fine. It's not going to cost me anything, is it? And I said, no, absolutely not. I'll foot the bill for everything. And he said, what's involved? And I kind of explained to him, we'll put out a newsletter. We'll, maybe send out some 8x10s. And in typical Nick fashion, he said, as long as I don't have to get involved at all, live it up if this is what you want to do, if you're a glutton for punishment, blah, blah, blah. Sign the permission slip, and I sent it into the magazines. The Bockwinkel Brigade was born in 1971, and, to me, the Bockwinkel Brigade still lives on, but officially we kind of disbanded as far as sending out newsletters and what have you. I want to say mid to late 80s, probably when Nick went to the WWE or WWF as an agent in 1987. That was kind of the finish of it. So as far as I know, Tim, we were the longest running, continuously running fan club specifically for a wrestling honorary ever. We were fortunate enough in 1972, the Lean Mean Machine newsletter won the Wrestling Fans International Association Journal of the Year Award at their convention. And then in 1977, the Bockwinkel Brigade was the Fan Club of the Year also through the WFIA at their convention in Houston. So I was very, very proud of what we did. And the newsletter itself it stood alone. I talked about how I would start to get a little sarcastic in the wrestling newsletters that I put out in the 60s. That was nothing compared to what I did when I started the Bockwinkel Brigade, because Nick, as an honorary, as you said a minute ago, it was kind of fitting that a sarcastic, witty, whatever kind of newsletter, challenging the baby faces, challenging authority, standing up for the heels. That was what I did. That was the Bockwinkel Brigade newsletter. And Nick got such a charge out of it, he used to show all the boys in the locker room. And, the rest is history. It was best of times.
That's so cool. And just sitting here hearing about that today. And so how much... You said, so Nick wanted you to run it. So, yeah, obviously he was, we hear the stories of how much they were on the road and stuff like that. But how much of how did you correspond with Nick then during the 70s?
I got to tell you, he was so great. When I said initially that he didn't want to get involved, that was such BS. Because, Nick would always have to be aloof and what have you. He had a core group of fans in this Bockwinkel Brigade, and I don't know how many hundreds of fans I had over the years all over the country. But there was a core group of fans, typically in the AWA area, Rockford, Moline, Davenport, Chicago, Denver, Omaha, up into Winnipeg, that were so loyal to him, and he would take time at the matches to greet those fans. And typically once a year, we would have what I call the Bockwinkel Brigade conventions in the Twin Cities, and we might get a couple dozen, maybe 30 people that would come in. They would fly in or drive in specifically to get together with the other Nick fans, because it was such a clique. We were such a fraternity, so loyal, fiercely loyal to each other. And Nick would take time out. I would check with him several months in advance, say, hey, this is when I'm thinking of doing this. When are you going to be available? Could you come out and talk with us for a little while? Typically, we would get together at the studios. Maybe Nick would meet with us for 45 minutes or an hour before he had to wrestle or go do his TV tapings. He would answer questions. He would pose for pictures. He'd sign autographs. We had him come to a couple of dinners, actual banquets that we hosted for the Bockwinkel Brigade. He was very involved from that standpoint. Anytime I asked him to write a column for our newsletter, he would do it. Sometimes he would type something up at 3 o'clock in the morning, or if he was on the road, he would handwrite 6 or 7 pages at 3 o'clock in the morning and mail it to me, just commenting on the current wrestling scene, in character. He was so incredibly great and so loyal to us. All at the same time, he would rib me just unmercifully. Every time he saw me, he would kind of stick the needle in and take his little sarcastic pot shots. But that was a badge of honor. I can't tell you. I just can't tell you how much it meant. And that evolved into a friendship that lasted 44 years, 45 years before Nick passed away in November of 2015. So the correspondence was constant, and he was as dedicated to us in his own way as we were to him.
Wow. That story is just so cool, and just, as a wrestling fan today, it makes me so envious that I couldn't live in that generation, and because now today, I'm a diehard wrestling fan, and wrestling has been a part of my life since I've been 3 or 4 years old, but we just don't have some of those opportunities, and I think, we have some great things with the internet and stuff like that, and we can get our results and everything better, but we don't have that personal stuff like that. Things like the Cauliflower Alley Club, Hall of Fames around the country, and stuff like that give you a little chance to meet, and many of the wrestlers are so nice and gracious with their time and stuff like that. And even, for me, getting to interview Mean Gene Okerlund for 10 minutes earlier this year was like, wow. I'm interviewing Mean Gene Okerlund, the guy who I grew up watching his interviews, and for him to take 10 minutes of his time to do that. But what you guys had back in the 70s was just amazing with the availability of the wrestlers and stuff like that.
Well, it's such a changed world, Tim. I mentioned that earlier on. If you haven't lived through it, you don't get it. The newsletters today, are typically they're online newsletters, and they're so much more analytical, and they are so much more insider news and backstage, and like I said before, who's getting fired and who signed a contract and who's in the doghouse or whatever. And the modern day wrestling fan, as they call the internet smarts or marks or whatever they want to call them, I don't know if they have a sense of entitlement, but I think it kind of emboldens them. So when you go to the wrestling shows or you watch a wrestling show on television, they're chanting things that they might have read in the newsletter. Maybe it's insider stuff, whatever it might be. It's such a far cry from what it was back then. It was so innocent, and all we wanted to do was talk wrestling. All we wanted to do was figure out who was in what territory, and if we were going to get a chance to see a champion coming in anytime soon, if there was going to be some new talent, new rosters coming in. That's all we wanted to know back then, as opposed to now where everything is picked apart. And I guess it's society. All sports have kind of changed that way. I just kind of as an aside, I got to give credit though to Meltzer and Wade Keller. First of all, they built empires. Both of them did, on the strength of their newsletters. When I met Wade Keller in 1987, he had like a 4 or 5 page printed newsletter that he handed me, and he said, "Hey, tell me what you think of this." And look what it has evolved to. Plus the fact that when these guys started out releasing some of the information that they did, they were detested. They were absolutely despised by the wrestling community. I'm talking about the promoters or the company owners, even some of the wrestlers, what have you, for divulging this information. Now they become Bibles, where so many in the industry will look to the Kellers and Meltzers of the world and pay close attention to what they've said, and might even make some business decisions based on what they're reading in the newsletter. So it is just a 180-degree turnaround. from the simplicity back then to the complexity of today.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to share, this might get off topic just a little bit, but since you brought it up, I talked to Meltzer about a year ago, and because one of the things that fascinated me with him was when he was on the Donahue show when everyone was attacking Vince McMahon. I don't remember his name, but it was the ring announcer who was accusing, Mel Phillips, but then there was another announcer who was accusing Pat Patterson of having the affair, and so they were all on Donahue. So it's pretty much everybody attacking Vince McMahon. I think superstar Billy Graham was there, Barry O was there, like Barry Orton, and everyone was attacking Vince McMahon except for Meltzer, and Meltzer was the one guy. And it was like he said he wasn't there to attack McMahon, and at times it was like he was McMahon's only friend. And I asked him if that was like what that was like, and he's like, well, it's just kind of more like a day of work for me. He wasn't there as like, oh wow, this is an amazing. I mean, Meltzer was trying to get the truth out too, and like just working. That was one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had with another person in the wrestling world, just because I mean it's just so amazing that he's on the Donahue show, and to him that's just one day of work for him and doing his job.
Well, and amazingly enough, kind of what I was alluding to is here's a newsletter writer back in the day, and he's on Phil Donahue with Vince McMahon and all these stars, which shows you already back then the impact and the importance that a guy like Dave Meltzer had in the business. A lot of times, if you see stories on professional wrestling, especially here in the Twin Cities area, in the newspapers, Wade Keller is quoted all the time. So they're really noted for being authorities on the business. And back in the day, it's amazing how many of them were blackballed by the wrestling community, and now they're elevated almost to godlike status in some cases.
Yeah, they definitely persevere. But like I said, it's both of them very nice people, and so I will certainly always take their. I mean, they are just, if they're that nice to people like me, who's just an up and coming YouTuber, it's amazing how gracious they were to me. I want to get a couple more Nick Bockwinkel questions in quickly. So, I watched the AWA. I grew up in the AWA in the 80s. I mean, we went to the Twin Cities. I was at the 84 Thanksgiving. I was at the Wrestle Rock 2, I think, in the Metrodome, and all those things like that. That's what I grew up on. And we booed the heels, and we cheered the faces, and I don't remember a lot of the heels getting a lot of cheering. But so did you guys cheer Bockwinkel at that time? And how was that? What did that feel like in like the auditorium?
We cheered him, and it was like we had a death wish. And I'm not kidding you. I can tell you that we used to take road trips on the weekends, go to Milwaukee, Chicago, Green Bay, because a lot of times they would do back-to-back-to-back shows. And this is in the early 70s, middle 70s. And I know one time I wore a Wicked Nick Bockwinkel shirt to the Milwaukee Auditorium, and I think Nick was wrestling the Crusher at the time. Well, I might as well have walked across Interstate 494 at rush hour with a blindfold on. I mean, it was absolutely stupid of me to do that, but I got more threats, and I had beers thrown at me and everything else. I mean, for God's sake, not the Crusher in Milwaukee. I don't know what I was thinking. Another time, there was a group of us that went to a card in Cambridge, Minnesota, small town. Nick was on the card, main evented, and again, wearing the Bockwinkel t-shirt, we literally were chased out of town by some guys in a pickup truck. They wanted to kill us. Match at the Minneapolis Auditorium. Of all places, I'm standing in a urinal, and people recognize me as being the Bockwinkel Brigade fan club president. A couple of guys that were, well into their cups. They weren't feeling any pain, and they started making chants about Nick while I'm standing there going to the bathroom, and one of them even took a shot at me. He took a punch at me as I'm walking out of the bathroom. So back in the day, you were taking your life into your hands. We were exceptionally loud at the TV studios when we would go to the tapings, to the point where Roger Kent, the late AWA announcer, would acknowledge, on the microphone, the Bockwinkel Brigade is here in full force. I think Nick felt a little sheepish about it. He didn't necessarily want to say anything to us to tone it down a little bit, but I know for a fact the wrestling office, especially Vern, Greg, guys like that, hated the fact that we were cheering the heels. I think things probably started to change on the national level when the Road Warriors became kind of the trendy, the badass heels, and people started to cheer for the heels more than they did before. And now, of course, in this day and age, you don't know who they're going to cheer and boo at any given moment. But back then, absolutely, it was scary. It was very scary to cheer for the heels.
Well, hey, I commend you for standing up for what you believed in, and that
whatever.
I could imagine that. And I remember, like I said, '84. I was at the Thanksgiving show, and I still remember the Road Warriors against Jerry Blackwell, and they called him Boom Boom Bundy. Because I think because it was King Kong Brody, they didn't want to confuse that with King Kong Bundy, so Vern called him Boom Boom Bundy, so it would have been King Kong Bundy, and Blackwell and Bundy were the faces, I guess, and because I remember everyone cheered for the Road Warriors, even though they were supposedly the heels, and so that's still one of the biggest shows I mean, that was like that's the first, if you go back in time, I was a wrestling fan 82, 83, but the first matches I remember going to was at Thanksgiving. I was old enough then to remember certain parts of that show and stuff like that. And I think anytime Jerry Blackwell and King Kong Bundy are teaming up together, that's pretty memorable in itself. And then against the Road Warriors, what a main event that day. Something I've always been a fan of, and I actually had a chance to talk to Nick about this, and I talked to Nick, like you said, and I don't have to explain it to you. Nick was so gracious, and even with someone like me, if I'd get a minute or two with him at a convention or something, he was always treated me so well, and he always talked so articulate, so it was really fun. And then so I decided, instead of just asking him a basic question like everyone else asked him, I asked him about his time as an announcer in WWF at the time. This would have been around, I believe, 1988, like you said, right after I think he became an agent, and then he ended up kind of being on the announce team many times with Bruce Pritchard and Mike McGurk, and and then every once in a while he would end up with Gorilla Monsoon as well. It'd be just him and Gorilla, but a lot of the times I would assume it'd be on their Madison Square Garden shows or Boston Garden shows. He would have been on the team with Pritchard and McGurk, and he was almost like the heel announcer, but not quite. Like his announcing was a first. I mean, no one had ever announced like him before. It was like he wasn't a direct heel, but he was the smartest guy in the room, to the point where he wasn't afraid to be the heel, and like he was going to put you down if you were saying things that weren't smart. He was going to put you down in a way, but it wasn't like he was taking over the announcing. That was his way of announcing, and it worked so well. And he said he really enjoyed that, the times I got to talk to him about it. And he said, it was like, I just tried to be myself and stuff like that. And it worked out really well and stuff like that. Do you have any more stories on that of any kind?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting that you said it worked out well. It worked out well. I enjoyed it. I loved it. I loved listening to Nick, and he was very analytical. But what was happening was, because WWF, and then eventually WWE, was becoming so bombastic and so glitzy that Nick's tenure as an announcer really didn't last all that long, because they went to guys like Jesse Ventura or Bobby Heenan or whoever it was. They needed more of a showboat as an announcer to keep pace with what the product that they were presenting. So in that sense, Nick's tenure as an announcer wasn't all that long. Fans can remember too that after that he went down to WCW in the 90s as their on-screen gimmick commissioner.
Yeah.
And there's another case where, and I've told this story before, and I know I'm kind of getting off the beaten path as far as Nick's announcing is concerned, but this is kind of parallel parlaying into what he did after he was an active wrestler. He went down as their on-screen commissioner, and I remember I got a call from Nick. Oh, I forget what year it was, maybe 92, 93, I don't know. And he said, do you watch WCW? And I said, I watch it pretty religiously. Why do you want to know? He says, well, you know, I'm their on-screen commissioner. I said, yeah, I'm aware of that. And Nick said, can you tell me what's been going on down there? He says, I don't really pay much attention to the product, and I'm going down there and cut some promos, and I would at least like to have some idea what I'm talking about. So I thought that was absolutely classic, how something went so totally full circle that me, a snot-nosed kid approaching him for an autograph in a fan club in 1971, now 25 or, you know, whatever, 20 years later, he's asking me what the storylines are so he doesn't flub his lines on television. So just great stuff, and God, do I miss him. I can't begin to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've met him probably about 6 or 7 times. Most notably, I mean, he was the president of the Cauliflower Alley Club for many years, which shows how much respect he had for the business, and then on top of that, how much respect the business had back for him. I mean, that's a very prestigious role to have right now, held by B. Brian Blair, who's another great ambassador for the business. And but Cauliflower, and I'll encourage people to. I mean, Cauliflower Alley Cup, it's not a fan fest. You don't go there to get autographs and stuff like that. You go there to really be a part of a wrestling family, and it's just an amazing event every year. Usually in April or May. I think this year it's just in early May. You can go to their website or Facebook page and find out the exact dates. But it's a way what they do is it's a nonprofit just to earn some money for the wrestlers who have these medical. A lot of the wrestlers from this who are getting up there in age now from the 70s and 80s didn't have the right medical insurance, and I mean they were independent contractors. They're having hip surgeries, knee surgeries, just getting old, and just basic medical expenses, and these guys help them out in a great way, and yet it's such a great time. Like, that's where I got to interview Mean Gene Okerlund there this year, and that was such cool. Pat Patterson's there. The Rock's mom, I've talked to her for a while. It's amazing. Go back on the channel. There's tons of interviews from that, and I'd encourage you, if you've enjoyed today's interview, to go back to my first interview and see how much has changed too, and how nervous I was that very first interview with Mick Karch. That was a few months ago. Actually, it might even be close to a year ago. But we just talked about some AWA wrestling, and I really enjoyed just talking AWA wrestling with you, Mick. And now today we got to learn the history of the Bockwinkel Brigade and a lot of the new. So I learned more today than I ever have in an interview with someone, and it was my goal. And I'm hoping that a lot of people, either my age or younger, also can appreciate what it was like back then, because we did not get to experience that. And so I'd encourage them to go back and listen to AWA Unabridged with Mick Karch, where we just kind of talked about AWA wrestling, I think mostly from the 70s and 80s there for a while, and that was very informative too. Is there anything you else want to add from our whole discussion today?
Nothing, except that, it's great to have the opportunity to talk about the old days. Wrestling, to a lot of the modern-day wrestling fans, Tim, there is no wrestling history before 1984, and that's what's sad about it. If you're a baseball fan, you're still talking about Pete Rose, or you're talking about Babe Ruth, or Mickey Mantle, or whatever it might be. If you're a football fan, you talk about the Joe Montanas, or Johnny Unitas, or whoever. Wrestling fans, because the business itself is cyclical, wrestling fans themselves are also kind of transient by nature, so not a lot of them are interested in what happened prior to Hulk Hogan. So anytime a guy like me can get on and relive those days verbally and share the memories, it's a great treat. I think you do a great job, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we appreciate having you kind of on that same line, and I know we gave Steel Domain a big plug earlier, but what you guys have done with Crusher Kowalski, and you've honored him a couple different times. He's pretty much the oldest living legend wrestler left, as we've said in the United States, and what a wrestler he was. And that's the problem, is honestly, I mean, I have to go back and find, and there isn't, I mean, you go to WWE Network and you can't find a lot on someone like him. I can go back to the magazines from the 60s, and I don't even, I mean, I don't have a lot of, I'd say I maybe have about 60 to 70 from the 60s, and I can find stuff on him there, and I'm always looking for new ones when I can afford them. But at the same time, yeah, there's just, I wish I mean, as great as WWE Network is in some ways, and it's good for, like you said, the 80s and stuff too, but to go back, I wish I could go back and see more Crusher Kowalski matches, more matches with the Crusher and the Bruiser, early Nick Bockwinkel matches, Vern Gagne matches, and stuff like that, and Lou Thesz matches and stuff like that, and it's just something that we aren't afforded today, unfortunately, because there's so much content out, and I don't blame the WWE for wanting to push the stuff that they created and stuff like that, but yeah, sometimes it seems like there should be, with our technology today, we should be able to get more wrestling and more of the classic stuff, and there just isn't enough of it out there. But it's been so great to meet, I mean, Crusher and his whole family, I mean, his sons and they're just amazing as a family. So it's just, and once again, it's like, it's like they're just as excited about meeting me as I am to meet the Crusher, because it's like, they're just like, you want to talk to our dad, and that is so, and they're so humbled by it, and I'm just like, no, I'm this is, the pleasure's all mine. I mean, I get to meet a great wrestling legend, and he is so kind as well. So I appreciate Steel Domain for doing that, and there's going to be some of us are still trying to keep that alive, and like you mentioned, George Shire and other great people like that, and some people at the Cauliflower Alley Club and stuff. We're trying our best to keep it alive because we still love it.
Well, and just real quickly, before we sign off, I wanted to address what you were saying about, the lack of availability to look at, Stan Kowalski's history or whatever. Stan, of course, was one half of the first AWA Tag Team Champions with the late Tiny Mills. The problem is none of that footage is still around. Back in the day in the 1960s, all those terrific AWA matches with Larry Hennig and Harley Race as a team, or Crusher and Bruiser, early Mad Dog Vachon against Vern Gagne, you name it. What would happen is Vern would tape over the actual videotapes. He would reuse them over and over again when he would tape his All-Star Wrestling TV show. Nothing was saved. So all the archival footage that I would dearly love to see is just not there. To my knowledge, there is no Tiny Mills and Stan Kowalski footage, even film footage, anywhere out there. Larry Hennig and Harley Race, when they were the AWA Tag Team Champions, I don't think that's out there. So in that sense, that's just a part of the history that you don't have access to, and that's why, again, Tim, I got to thank you, because just talking about it, hopefully I didn't ramble on too much. I just want to give the wrestling community, especially the younger fans, a sense of what it was like back then in what I call the golden age, the golden era of professional wrestling. So again, thank you so much. It's always such a kick to be on with a guy who loves the business the way you do.
Well, thank you, and yeah, well, I mean, honestly, for me, as we wrap up here, I'm going to tell a quick story about, I mean, I met you because I went to the Steel Domain show, and you guys were honoring a young man named Gavin, I believe, who was having he had a brain tumor, and was just, he was a huge wrestling fan, and raising money to help with all those huge medical costs that would come with something like that. And I'm like, hey, if I can mix wrestling and helping out a kid too, that's even great. I came up, Steel Domain. I live in western Minnesota, so I don't quite have the Twin Cities in my radar as much, but that time it was like, I definitely have to go to this show. And sitting there, someone had, you had the gimmick table, which is where you sell stuff, and all the old TNT news, Terry Justice, who we didn't mention, but one of the great newsletter writers, and all the TNT Times you were selling. And so I came up to the table, I'm like, wow, this is like a jackpot here. And you had like 100 of them, and I'm like, I wonder if you'll give me a deal if I buy them all. And then, so you weren't even there at that time, and then so whoever was running the table, I said, hey, can I make an offer on all of them? Well, you'll have to talk to Mick Karch. I'm like, Mick Karch is here? I know who that is. It's like, he's an AWA announcer. I didn't know he was still around. here.
Did we cut you a deal?
Yeah, you did cut me a deal. Yeah, well, you even had some at home then, and yeah, we cut a whole. I mean, you've been hit in the head with a chair a few too many times. You don't remember that because it's still a big memory in my life. And yeah, you the next Steel Domain show, then you brought your whole collection from home. We cut a deal on them, and I started my newsletter collection, which that's a great way for me to learn all about the 70s, and I think it was mostly TNT time. Well, it's probably a lot of the ones that you were trading back at the time. TNT Times, Championship Wrestling, main events and stuff like that. And I don't think I've read them all yet, but I break those out all the time and try to learn that letters. But more than that, thankful that I made a friend in you. I mean, like I said, I knew who you were. I didn't know you were in the cities. I didn't know that you had a part in Steel Domain or anything like that. It was just, but I did know who you were from the AWA, and I'm like, so I got a picture with you that day too, and you didn't even charge me. How cool is that? I mean,
the more I hear about this, Tim, I'm actually getting sick to my stomach. Number one, that I didn't charge you for the picture. Number two, that I cut you any deals. So here's what I'm going to say to you, pal, as we wrap up. Stick around long enough, because now I'm hell-bent on making up for that lost money. Somehow or other, I'm gonna make it all back. You're gonna
make it all back. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mick Karch, for joining us. This was a great. I really hope the listeners appreciated this today. This was great, just talking. I hope we can do this again soon. My listeners, do send the fan. Maybe I need to print off some of this fan mail and show you the emails. Or I don't know if people as old as you have email that I can maybe just forward the emails or something when they come. But they really do praise this wrestling knowledge, and so there are still a lot of fans out there who do appreciate this old school wrestling stories and the stories that you tell, and the stories that you told today, I think, made the show great today. I mean, just amazing. I'm going to go back and listen to the stories again as when I can actually listen to them rather than trying to record everything here. But I hope that we can do this again very soon in the future, and I will see you very soon, either at a Steel Domain show or at some other event. But thank you so much, Mick.
You got it. Thank you, Tim.